In the forgotten archives of the Wisconsin Diocese, there exists a collection of documents that the Catholic Church has attempted to bury for over 160 years. These papers detail the systematic disappearance of 23 nuns from St. Mary's Convent near Lake Michigan between 1854 and 1862. Church officials have dismissed these records as administrative errors and misinterpretations, but the testimony of 3 separate diocesan inspectors, along with a cache of private correspondence recently discovered in a sealed wall cavity during renovations, tells a story so horrific that even hardened historians have questioned whether such evil could truly exist within hallowed walls. What follows is the first comprehensive account of what many consider to be the most disturbing case of religious corruption in American history. A case that the Catholic Church has spent a fortune ensuring you would never hear. Before we continue with the story of St. Mary's Convent, I must ask, if you're finding this tale already unsettling, please subscribe to our channel for more historically accurate accounts of America's darkest religious secrets. Our community of mystery seekers spans all 50 states. Where are you listening from tonight? Leave a comment below. Now let's return to the Wisconsin countryside of 1854, where our story begins. The morning fog hung heavy over Lake Michigan as Bishop William Quarter's carriage rolled through the gates of what would become St. Mary's Convent. The Catholic Church had purchased the sprawling estate, a former lumber baron's mansion surrounded by 30 acres of dense woodland, with the intention of establishing the first major Catholic institution in the largely Protestant Wisconsin territory. This strategic expansion was part of a broader push to establish Catholic influence in America's rapidly developing frontier regions, where Protestant denominations were already gaining significant footholds. The limestone mansion with its 3 imposing wings and bell tower stood in stark contrast to the humble wooden churches that dotted the Wisconsin landscape. The central building, constructed in 1842, featured Gothic arches and narrow windows that seemed to watch like eyes over the surrounding countryside. 2 wings extended from either side, the east wing intended for the nuns' quarters, the west for the proposed orphanage and infirmary. Behind the main structure stood a small chapel, its spire rising above the treetops, visible from miles away across the flat Wisconsin plains. Local Protestant families viewed the arriving nuns with suspicion, their black habits and Irish accents, marking them as outsiders in a community dominated by German and Scandinavian settlers. The region's residents, primarily Lutheran and Methodist, had grown accustomed to the simple democratic structure of their own religious communities. The hierarchical nature of Catholicism, with its rituals and secrets, felt foreign and threatening. On the day of the convent's consecration, a small crowd gathered outside the gates. "Papists," muttered Elijah Hoffman, a respected elder at the local Lutheran church, as he watched the black-robed figures process into the chapel. "They'll bring their foreign ways here, corrupt our children with their idolatry." His companion, Wilhelm Schmidt, nodded grimly. "My grandfather fled Germany to escape the Catholics' persecution. Now, they follow us even here." This sentiment, though not universal, reflected the deep religious tensions that would form the backdrop for the tragedy to come. "St. Mary's will serve as a beacon of God's mercy in this wilderness," Bishop Quarter announced to the small gathering of clergy and local dignitaries at the consecration ceremony. His voice echoed through the newly completed chapel, where morning light filtered through simple stained glass windows, casting pools of colored light across the wooden pews. Under the guidance of Mother Superior Catherine Murphy, this convent will offer shelter to orphans, comfort to widows, and healing to the sick. The bishop's Boston accent echoed off the stone walls as he introduced the 3 women who would lead the convent: Mother Superior Catherine, Sister Elizabeth Foster, and Sister Margaret Clark, all from established convents in the East. Mother Superior Catherine stood tall and imposing in her crisp black habit, her sharp features and penetrating gaze commanding instant respect. At 42, she carried herself with the confidence of a woman accustomed to authority. Her hands, when raised in prayer, were elegant but strong, hands that looked equally capable of comforting a child or disciplining a wayward novice. Those who met her often commented on her eyes, an unusual pale blue that seemed to see through pretense. Mother Catherine comes to us with the highest recommendations, the bishop continued. Her work at St. Augustine's in Boston has prepared her well for the challenges of frontier religious life. Sister Elizabeth, 38, with her perpetual smile and soft voice, would oversee the orphanage. Plump and maternal, with rosy cheeks and gentle hands, she seemed perfectly suited to care for abandoned children. When she spoke, it was always with a slight hesitation, as if carefully considering each word, a trait that many initially interpreted as thoughtfulness rather than calculation. Sister Margaret, 35, with her extensive knowledge of herbal remedies, would establish the infirmary. Tall and thin, with a serious demeanor and nimble fingers, she carried herself with the precision of someone who measured medicines by the drop. Her dark eyes missed nothing, and her knowledge of both traditional and modern medical practices had impressed physicians in Boston and New York. 20 younger nuns, most in their 20s and newly arrived from Ireland, completed the founding community. They stood in a perfect line, habits crisp, heads bowed in appropriate humility, as Bishop Quarter blessed each by name. Sister Agnes O'Connor, Sister Bernadette Walsh, Sister Teresa Donovan, Sister Mary Collins, young women who had left behind family and homeland to serve God in a strange new country. Their faces, though solemn during the ceremony, occasionally betrayed their youth and uncertainty when they thought no one was watching. "The Lord has called us to this wilderness," Mother Catherine addressed her sisters that first evening, candlelight casting long shadows across the refectory. The smell of fresh bread and weak tea hung in the air, and the chill of the Wisconsin autumn seeped through the stone walls despite the large fireplace at the room's end. "We will face hardships unknown to our Eastern counterparts. We will encounter suspicion from those who fear our faith, but we shall overcome through devotion and sacrifice." The young nuns, far from home and family, clung to her words like a lifeline in this strange new world. Sister Agnes whispered to Sister Bernadette as they prepared for bed that night, their narrow cots separated by barely an arm's length in the dormitory-style sleeping quarters. "Do you think the locals will ever accept us?" Her voice trembled slightly, betraying the brave face she had maintained all day. Sister Bernadette squeezed her hand in the darkness. "They feared our Lord too at first. We must show them through our works that we mean only good." The whispered conversation ended abruptly at the sound of footsteps in the corridor, Mother Catherine making her rounds, ensuring all was in order on their first night. The convent quickly established itself as a functioning religious community. The daily rhythm of prayers began with matins at 3 a.m., the bells toll cutting through the pre-dawn darkness, summoning sleepy nuns from warm beds to cold chapel floors. The distinctive drone of Latin chants filled the chapel 7 times daily, from those early morning prayers through to Compline at 9 p.m. The sound became as much a part of the local landscape as the wind through the pines or the distant lowing of cattle. Between prayers, the nuns operated a small orphanage for abandoned children, tended the sick in a modest infirmary, and maintained extensive vegetable gardens. Their days followed a strict schedule: prayer, work, simple meals, brief recreation, more prayer. A rhythm designed to focus the mind on God and service rather than individual comfort or desire. By the winter of 1854, the orphanage housed 12 children, mostly the offspring of Irish immigrant laborers who had died in railway or lumber accidents. Sister Elizabeth oversaw their care with apparent tenderness, teaching basic letters and numbers alongside Catholic doctrine. On Sundays, local families would sometimes visit after Mass, bringing small treats for the children and occasionally inquiring about adoption. Sister Margaret's infirmary began modestly but quickly gained respect among local families. Her knowledge of traditional remedies, poultices for inflammation, herbal teas for fevers, special compresses for chest ailments, proved effective, especially during the harsh Wisconsin winter when doctor visits required dangerous travel through snow-choked roads. Their self-sufficiency impressed even the most skeptical neighbors, and gradually the local attitude shifted from suspicion to grudging respect. "They keep to themselves, but they do good work," admitted Elijah Hoffman grudgingly to his congregation after Sister Margaret had successfully treated his grandson's persistent cough. "Their ways are not our ways, but perhaps there is room for different paths to heaven in this big country." Sister Agnes O'Connor, at 23, was among the youngest nuns at St. Mary's. Her letters home to Ireland, preserved in the Dublin Diocesan Archive, provide a rare glimpse into the early days of the convent. Her careful penmanship filled pages with observations about her new life, though close readers might note the gradually changing tone as months passed. "The work is harder than I ever imagined," she wrote in December 1854, the paper bearing smudges, suggesting tears had fallen as she wrote. "My hands are raw from washing linens in ice-cold water, and the chapel stones feel like ice beneath our knees during morning prayers. But Mother Catherine assures us that our sacrifices please God. Sister Elizabeth has been particularly kind, helping me adjust to this strange country. She brings me extra blankets on the coldest nights and has shown such patience in teaching me the proper care of the orphans. Sister Margaret's remedies saved us during a fever that swept through the orphanage last month." She continued, "The children burned with such heat we feared we would lose them all, but her tincture of willow bark and honey brought down their temperatures. I believe we are doing God's work, though I confess I still cry myself to sleep some nights, missing the green hills of home. What these letters do not reveal, what Sister Agnes herself might not have fully comprehended, were the subtle changes already taking place within St. Mary's walls. Mother Catherine's leadership style, initially merely strict, had begun to shift toward the autocratic. Minor infractions of convent rules, previously addressed with gentle correction, now resulted in increasingly severe penances. Sister Josephine Brady's hands shook as she attempted to darn a tear in her habit one evening in January 1855. Having accidentally broken silence during afternoon prayers with a sudden cough, she had been assigned to kneel on dried peas while reciting the entire rosary, a penance that left her knees bleeding and swollen. Sister Mary Collins helped her thread the needle, their eyes meeting in a moment of silent sympathy. "Do not draw attention to her weakness." Mother Catherine's voice cut through the quiet workroom, causing both women to startle. She had entered silently, a skill that increasingly unsettled the younger nuns. "Sister Josephine must learn that. Discipline is the cornerstone of devotion. Each of you would do well to remember that." By the spring of 1855, St. Mary's had gained a reputation for exceptional charity. When a measles epidemic swept through the nearby lumber camps, Sister Margaret's infirmary treated dozens of workers, regardless of their faith. The convent began, receiving modest donations from grateful families, and even Protestant ministers acknowledged the good work being done behind those limestone walls. What no one outside the convent realized was that life inside St. Mary's was changing in subtle, disturbing ways. The communal meals had become increasingly silent affairs, with nuns keeping their eyes fixed on their bowls of thin soup or plates of plain bread. The recreation hour, once filled with quiet conversation and occasional laughter, grew tense and muted. Young women who had crossed an ocean together, bonded by shared purpose and faith, now moved like shadows, careful not to draw attention. The first strange occurrence came in April 1855, when Sister Agnes failed to appear for morning prayers. Her absence was immediately noticed. One empty place in the chapel where 20 nuns should stand in perfect formation. The other sisters exchanged quick, concerned glances as Mother Catherine entered, her expression unreadable in the dim candlelight. "Sister Agnes has been called to assist at our mission in Minnesota," Mother Catherine announced to the bewildered community at breakfast, her tone brooking no questions. Her departure was sudden, as such callings often are. "We shall all pray for her success in this new endeavor." Sister Bernadette's spoon clattered against her bowl. "But Mother, she said nothing to me. And we—" She fell silent as Mother Catherine's pale eyes fixed on her face. "Are you suggesting, Sister Bernadette, that a bride of Christ requires permission from her fellows rather than her superiors before answering God's call?" The question hung in the air like frost. "No, Mother." "Forgive me." Sister Bernadette lowered her eyes to her cooling porridge. No one had seen Sister Agnes pack or leave, and she had mentioned nothing of a transfer in her letters home. But in the strict hierarchy of convent life, no one dared question Mother Superior's explanation further. That evening in the dormitory, several nuns noticed Sister Agnes's few possessions: her prayer book, the small wooden rosary her mother had given her, the extra woolen stockings for Wisconsin winters, were gone, as if she had indeed packed and departed. But Sister Mary Collins, whose cot had been beside Agnes's, whispered to Sister Teresa Donovan during their brief moments alone in the garden. Her cloak still hung on its peg. Would she have left without it in April in Minnesota? Sister Teresa glanced nervously toward the convent windows. Perhaps she was given a new one for the journey. "We should not speculate, Sister." 3 months later, Sister Bernadette Walsh vanished in similar fashion. "The bishop has requested Sister Bernadette's assistance with a delicate matter in Chicago," Mother Catherine explained. "She left before dawn to catch the early train." Again, no farewell, no warning. Just an empty cell and a hastily provided explanation. This time, Sister Elizabeth elaborated during the nuns' work period. "Sister Bernadette showed such skill with the orphans that the bishop has requested she help establish proper procedures at the new foundling home in Chicago." Her voice carried the appropriate mix of pride and pious acceptance. But Sister Mary noticed that her usually warm eyes remained cold as she spoke. By the winter of 1855, 3 more nuns had transferred to distant missions. Each departure followed the same pattern. A young nun, usually one who had drawn attention for her beauty or gentle nature, would simply fail to appear one morning. Mother Catherine would announce her reassignment, always to a location too distant for easy verification. Letters sent by worried families to these supposed new assignments would return months later with brief, oddly formal responses that provided few details of their new lives. The responses, when examined years later by handwriting experts, would all be identified as written by the same person, not the missing nuns themselves. Sister Teresa Donovan was one of the few who dared voice concerns, tall and strong from years of farm work before taking her vows with a directness unusual. In convent life, she had already drawn Mother Catherine's disapproval for questioning the increasing severity of penances assigned to younger nuns. It seemed strange that Rome would request so many transfers without proper documentation, she whispered to Sister Mary Collins as they worked in the garden in the summer of 1856, their fingers stained with soil as they harvested early carrots. The garden had expanded that year, with a new section dedicated to medicinal herbs that Sister Margaret tended personally behind a high fence that none but she and Mother Catherine could enter. "And have you noticed it's always the youngest and prettiest who are called away?" Sister Teresa continued, her Irish brogue thickening as it always did when she was upset. First Agnes with her golden hair, then Bernadette with those lovely, singing voice, then Catherine with her perfect complexion and Josephine with her... She trailed off as a shadow fell across the garden bed. Sister Mary hushed her immediately, glancing nervously toward the convent windows where Sister Margaret stood watching, her thin face expressionless. Mother Catherine has her reasons. We must trust in her wisdom. The following week, Sister Teresa was gone. Called to a contemplative retreat in Montreal, was the official explanation provided at morning prayers. Sister Mary, now thoroughly frightened, kept her head down and her thoughts to herself. That evening, as she made her bed, she found a small piece of paper tucked beneath her pillow. A page torn from Sister Teresa's prayer book with a hastily scrawled message in the margin. Something is wrong. If I disappear, tell Father Ryan. The sight of her friend's handwriting, the ink still relatively fresh, sent a chill through Sister Mary that had nothing to do with the autumn air seeping through the stone walls. By 1857, the pattern had become impossible to ignore within the convent walls. Of the original 20 junior nuns, only 12 remained. The official explanations continued: special missions, retreats, transfers to nursing positions during disease outbreaks. To the outside world, St. Mary's continued to function normally. Local families still brought sick relatives to Sister Margaret's infirmary. Orphans still received care in Sister Elizabeth's orphanage. Sunday visitors saw nothing amiss in the solemn processions of black-clad figures moving from chapel to garden to refectory. But inside those limestone walls, fear had become a tangible presence. The remaining nuns spoke in whispers, avoided being alone, and watched in terror as their numbers dwindled. Mother Catherine's leadership grew more authoritarian. Minor infractions of convent rules resulted in severe penances, days of fasting, nights spent in prayer on cold stone floors, public confessions of increasingly intimate sins. Sister Claire O'Donnell, discovered with a small piece of chocolate sent by her family, was forced to kneel before the entire community and confess to gluttony and deception unworthy of a bride of Christ. Mother Catherine assigned her to fast for 3 days, taking only water and a single piece of bread at evening meal. When Sister Claire fainted during chapel prayers on the 2nd day, it was Sister Margaret who revived her with smelling salts. Her thin lips curved in what some later described as a smile. One unusually cold night in January 1858, Sister Mary Collins awoke to muffled sounds from the cell next to hers. Through the thin wall, she could hear Sister Rebecca Murphy sobbing, then a sharp whisper she recognized as Mother Catherine's voice. "You will come with us now. Make any noise, and you'll regret it." The sound of shuffling feet followed, then silence. Sister Mary lay frozen in her narrow bed, heart pounding so loudly she feared it would betray her wakefulness. The floorboards in the corridor creaked, 1, 2, 3 sets of footsteps moving away from Sister Rebecca's cell. Then a sound that would haunt Sister Mary's dreams for years to come. A muffled cry, quickly silenced, followed by what sounded like a body being dragged rather than walking of its own accord. The next morning, Mother Catherine announced that Sister Rebecca had been called to serve at a frontier mission in the Dakota Territory. The native children there require instruction, and Sister Rebecca's patience with the orphans has prepared her well for this holy task. Mother Catherine's pale eyes swept the refectory, lingering momentarily on Sister Mary. We shall miss her gentle presence, but rejoice in God's purpose for her talents. Sister Mary, shaking with fear, managed to maintain her composure through morning prayers. Her rosary beads clicked between trembling fingers as she mouthed the familiar prayers, her mind racing with terrible possibilities. What had happened to Sister Rebecca? What had happened to all the others? That afternoon, while sweeping the corridor outside Mother Catherine's office, she overheard a disturbing conversation. The heavy oak door was not quite closed, and voices carried clearly to where Sister Mary stood, dust brush suddenly motionless in her hand. "The doctor says this one will fetch a higher price." Sister Elizabeth's usually gentle voice had taken on a cold, calculating tone that Sister Mary would not have recognized had she not been listening at that very door. "He says men pay extra for the innocent ones." "We need to be more careful with the timing," Sister Margaret replied, the sound of glass clinking suggesting she was organizing her medicines as she spoke. 3 in 1 month raises questions. The bishop's secretary mentioned it in his last letter. "The bishop is easily managed." Mother Catherine's dismissive laugh sent chills down Sister Mary's spine. "Another donation to his cathedral fund, and his questions will disappear. Besides, we've established the pattern well enough. No one questions nuns being sent to frontier missions or succumbing to illness during their charitable work." "What about the Collins girl?" Sister Margaret asked, her voice dropping lower. "She watches too closely. I've seen her listening at doors." A moment of silence followed, during which Sister Mary's heart nearly stopped. "We'll wait," Mother Catherine finally replied. "She's too plain to fetch much, and she has that correspondence with her brother in the seminary. Disappearing too many at once attracts attention. Rebecca will keep the doctor's clients satisfied for now." Sister Mary fled before she could be discovered, her mind racing. What had happened to her missing sisters? What terrible fate had befallen Sister Rebecca just last night? And who was this doctor they mentioned? The pieces began to fall into terrible place in her mind. The missing nuns, always the youngest and most attractive. The strange visits from well-dressed benefactors who toured the convent with Mother Catherine. The unexplained sounds, sometimes, heard from the locked north wing at night. The growing wealth of the convent, despite its supposedly humble means. After a sleepless night of prayer and deliberation, Sister Mary made a desperate decision. During her weekly duty collecting eggs from the chicken coop, the only time she was permitted beyond the convent walls without supervision, she slipped a hastily written note into the pocket of Jimmy Fletcher, the 12-year-old son of a local farmer who delivered milk to the convent each morning. Jimmy's eyes widened as Sister Mary's hand brushed his pocket. She had never spoken to him directly before. The rules forbade casual conversation with outsiders, especially males of any age. "Please deliver this to Father Thomas at St. Joseph's Church in town," she whispered, pressing a small silver cross into the boy's hand. The cross had been her confirmation gift, the only item of value she possessed. "Tell no one else. Lives depend on it." The boy nodded solemnly, his freckled face serious beyond his years. "Yes, sister, I promise." The note, which has been preserved in diocesan records, read simply, "Something evil happens at St. Mary's. Nuns disappearing, not sent away as claimed. I fear for my life. Please send help. Sister Mary Collins." Father Thomas Ryan, the young Irish priest who received the note, had always harbored reservations about Mother Catherine. During his monthly visits to offer Mass at the convent, he had noticed the dwindling number of nuns and found Mother Catherine's explanations vague and inconsistent. But as a mere parish priest, he had limited authority to question a Mother Superior. Father Ryan paced his small study, the worn floorboards creaking beneath his feet as he read and reread Sister Mary's desperate message. The silver cross lay heavy in his palm. He recognized it as the type given to young women at confirmation, not something a nun would part with lightly. The urgency of the message, combined with his own growing concerns, demanded action. But what action could he take against a Mother Superior, especially one as well connected as Catherine Murphy? Rather than confronting Mother Catherine directly, Father Ryan traveled to Milwaukee to speak with his superior, Bishop John Henney. Journey took a full day by horseback, the late winter roads alternating between ice and mud. He arrived at the bishop's residence with his cassock spattered and his resolve firm. Bishop Henny received him in a comfortably appointed study, far warmer and more luxurious than Father Ryan's humble parish house. Construction of Milwaukee's New St. John's Cathedral dominated the conversation initially, the bishop proudly showing architectural drawings and discussing funding with animation. "It will be the finest cathedral west of New York," Bishop Henny declared, his German accent still pronounced despite decades in America. "A proper monument to our faith in this Protestant wilderness." Father Ryan nodded appropriately, waiting for an opening to introduce his concerns. When the bishop finally asked about his parish, the young priest carefully laid out his observations. The dwindling number of nuns at St. Mary's, the inconsistent explanations, and finally the desperate note from Sister Mary. The bishop's expression changed as Father Ryan spoke, his initial warmth giving way to a careful neutrality. "These are serious accusations, Father," he said, setting aside the silver cross without examining it closely. "Mother Catherine has explained each transfer to my satisfaction. But Your Excellency, 8 nuns have disappeared in less than 3 years, Father Ryan pressed. "No documentation has been provided for these transfers. No one has received consistent correspondence from these women after they supposedly left. The frontier missions require educated women," the bishop replied, with finality, rising from his chair to indicate the meeting was concluding. "I'll not have you spreading rumors that could damage the Church's reputation in this Protestant region. Mother Catherine has been most generous in supporting our cathedral building fund. Her spiritual leadership is beyond reproach." As the bishop ushered him out, he added with a note of warning, "Focus on your parish duties, Father Ryan. Leave the administration of convents to those appointed by God for that purpose." Father Ryan left the bishop's office discouraged but not deterred. If the proper channels would not address his concerns, he would need to find another way to investigate the mysterious disappearances at St. Mary's. The opportunity came in March 1858, when Bishop Henny assigned Father Ryan to collect the annual financial reports from parishes and religious institutions throughout the diocese. This official capacity gave him legitimate reason to examine St. Mary's records and perhaps find evidence of what had happened to the missing nuns. The March winds cut through Father Ryan's heavy coat as his horse-drawn buggy approached St. Mary's. The convent looked different somehow, the gardens more neglected, the windows darker, despite the mild spring weather that should have brought the nuns outdoors for their work. The bell tower that had once rung clearly for each divine office now sounded less frequently, its tone somehow muted. He was met at the door by Sister Elizabeth, whose customary smile seemed strained. Dark circles beneath her eyes suggested sleepless nights, and her typically neat habit showed small signs of neglect, a missing pin, a slight stain on the white collar. "Father Ryan, we weren't expecting you today," she said, her surprise poorly concealed. "Mother Catherine is indisposed today," she continued, leading him to a small cold parlor rather than the comfortable study where he usually met with the Mother Superior. "She asks that you leave the diocesan forms, and she will complete them by week's end." "I'm afraid the bishop was quite clear," Father Ryan insisted, removing his coat and setting his briefcase on the table. He tried to project an authority he didn't entirely feel, aware that his youth and relatively low position in the church hierarchy worked against him. "I am to review the records personally this year. Financial irregularities have been discovered in several institutions." Sister Elizabeth's smile vanished entirely. "That won't be possible today. Our bookkeeper, Sister Margaret, is attending to a dying child in the infirmary." "Then I shall wait." Father Ryan settled more firmly in his chair. "Or perhaps I could tour the convent while waiting. It has been some time since I've seen the improvements to the orphanage I've heard so much about." The look that flashed across Sister Elizabeth's face, was it fear? Anger? vanished quickly. As you wish, Father, though I must ask you to avoid the north wing. We have several cases of influenza there, and would not want you exposed. The north wing, where Father Ryan had never been permitted to enter, ostensibly because it contained the nuns' private quarters. His suspicion deepened. The tour revealed a convent functioning far below its reported capacity. Where were the 20 orphans mentioned in Mother Catherine's reports to the diocese? Father Ryan counted only 7 children, all looking thin and frightened. When he attempted to speak with a small girl sweeping the dormitory floor, Sister Elizabeth quickly intervened, sending the child away on an errand. The infirmary, supposedly caring for dozens of local residents, contained only 3 elderly patients, none showing signs of the reported influenza. Sister Margaret was nowhere to be seen, despite her supposed attendance on a dying child. Most disturbing was the clear reduction in nuns. Father Ryan had offered Mass at St. Mary's just 3 months earlier, and recalled at least 15 nuns in attendance. Today, he counted only 8, including Sister Elizabeth. When he inquired about specific nuns, he remembered Sister Rebecca, Sister Josephine, Sister Claire. He received the same vague responses about transfers and special missions. And Sister Mary Collins? He asked casually as they passed the laundry room, where 2 nuns worked silently at large washtubs, steam rising around their reddened hands. Sister Elizabeth's step faltered slightly. Sister Mary has been assigned to our mission in St. Louis. She left just last week. Her experience with the orphans made her particularly suited to the work there. Father Ryan nodded, hiding his alarm. The author of the desperate note was now among the disappeared. His suspicions now fully aroused, he requested to see the convent's chapel before departing. The chapel, once immaculate, showed subtle signs of neglect. Dust on the altar rails, unpolished candlesticks, wilting flowers that should have been replaced. The sacred space that had once housed 23 nuns in prayer now felt hollow, as if the very stones sensed the wrongness that had infiltrated St. Mary's. While Sister Elizabeth was momentarily distracted by a message from a novice, Father Ryan slipped through a side door he knew led to the residential wing. The corridor was eerily silent for mid-afternoon. Many of the cells stood empty, personal items gone, as if their occupants had indeed departed. As he turned to leave, a barely audible sound caught his attention. Something between a whimper and a moan coming from behind a heavy wooden door at the end of the corridor. The door, unlike the others, had a substantial iron lock. Father Ryan approached cautiously, listening intently. The sound came again, definitely human, definitely distressed. Is someone there? He whispered through the keyhole. Do you need help? A moment of silence, then a hoarse female voice. Father, is that you? Please help us, please. Before he could respond, the unmistakable voice of Mother Catherine rang out behind him. Father Ryan, this area is strictly cloistered. Your presence here is most inappropriate. He turned to find Mother Catherine flanked by Sister Margaret, and a large man he didn't recognize, not dressed as clergy or medical personnel, but in the rough clothing of a laborer, with arms thick as tree trunks and a face set in a threatening scowl. Forgive me, Mother, Father Ryan managed, struggling to keep his voice steady. I became turned around after visiting the chapel. Mother Catherine's pale eyes assessed him coldly. She had lost weight since he'd last seen her, her habit hanging loosely on her frame, but her authority seemed only to have intensified. This wing houses sisters under special spiritual direction. Their seclusion is essential to their devotional practice. I heard someone calling for help. Father Ryan countered, gathering his courage. You heard Sister Anne in the midst of her spiritual exercises, Sister Margaret interjected smoothly. Some of our more dedicated sisters practice mortification of the flesh. Their cries can be misinterpreted by those unfamiliar with advanced devotional practices. "Mr. Callahan will show you out." Mother Catherine nodded to the burly man. "We will send the financial reports to Milwaukee by week's end." The man named Callahan stepped forward, his posture suggesting he was accustomed to enforcing Mother Catherine's will through means not entirely spiritual. "This way, Father," he said, his voice carrying a hint of menace beneath the forced politeness. The man gripped his arm with unnecessary force. Father Ryan caught one last glimpse of the locked door. Who had spoken to him? What did she mean by us? How many women were being held behind that door? The moment his buggy cleared the convent gates, Father Ryan whipped his horse into a gallop, his mind racing faster than the animal's hooves. The voice, the locked door, the missing nuns, the frightened children, the intimidating presence of the man called Callahan, all pointed to something sinister occurring at St. Mary's. This was beyond his authority as a parish priest. He needed official intervention. Bypassing Bishop Henney, whom he now suspected of either complicity or willful ignorance, Father Ryan sent an urgent telegram to Archbishop John Hughes in New York. Grave concerns regarding St. Mary's Convent, Wisconsin. Suspicious disappearances of multiple nuns. Evidence of imprisonment. Possible danger to remaining sisters. Request immediate diocesan investigation. Local bishop unresponsive. Father Thomas Ryan, St. Joseph's Parish. If you're feeling a chill down your spine as our story unfolds, you're not alone. Our community of mystery seekers often reports physical reactions to these dark historical accounts. Take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who appreciates true historical mysteries. Your engagement helps us continue uncovering America's hidden secrets. Now, as we return to 1858, a storm is brewing over St. Mary's Convent that will reveal horrors beyond imagination. Archbishop Hughes, known for his no-nonsense approach to diocesan management, responded swiftly. Rather than alerting Bishop Henney, he dispatched his personal secretary, Monsignor Patrick Kelly, to conduct a surprise inspection of St. Mary's. Monsignor Kelly arrived unannounced at the convent gates on April 17, 1858, accompanied by Father Ryan and two senior priests from neighboring parishes. The spring day dawned clear and mild, the kind of day that typically filled Wisconsin farmers with hope for the coming planting season. But as the clerical party approached St. Mary's, a sense of foreboding seemed to hang over the limestone buildings. Ravens circled the bell tower, their harsh cries breaking the morning stillness. The reception they received spoke volumes. Mother Catherine, usually composed and commanding, appeared flustered by their arrival. Her pale face flushed with what might have been anger or fear as she recognized Monsignor Kelly's official robes and the sealed documents he carried. The convent itself seemed in disarray, with nuns scurrying about in what appeared to be panicked activity. Through an open window, Father Ryan glimpsed two young nuns hastily carrying armfuls of papers toward the kitchen, where the large cast-iron stove burned regardless of the season's warmth. The acrid smell of burning paper drifted through the courtyard. "This is most irregular, Monsignor," Mother Catherine protested as the clerical party entered the main hall. Her voice, usually controlled and melodious, had taken on a brittle edge. "We have protocols for official visitations. Bishop Henney always sends word weeks in advance. Which is precisely why Archbishop Hughes instructed me to forego such notification," Monsignor Kelly replied coolly. In his 50s, with silver hair and the weathered face of a man who had seen both war and peace, the Monsignor projected an authority that even Mother Catherine seemed unable to challenge directly. "I have here a letter bearing the Archbishop's seal, authorizing a complete inspection of this institution, its records, and all its residents. I trust you will cooperate fully." Mother Catherine's eyes darted briefly to Sister Margaret, who stood half hidden in a doorway, her thin face unreadable. Some silent communication seemed to pass between them before Mother Catherine turned back. To Monsignor Kelly with a forced smile. "Of course, Monsignor. St. Mary's has nothing to hide. However, I must insist that you respect the enclosure of our cloistered sisters. Some are engaged in spiritual exercises that must not be interrupted. My authority extends to all areas of this convent, Mother Catherine," Monsignor Kelly replied, unfolding the Archbishop's letter and holding it before her. "No exceptions." What followed was a day-long investigation that would later be described, in Monsignor Kelly's 40-page report, as unveiling a tableau of horrors unprecedented in the modern church. The inspection team split up, with Father Ryan leading Monsignor Kelly directly to the locked door in the residential wing, while the other priests began interviewing the visible nuns and examining financial records. As they approached the north wing, they encountered Sister Elizabeth blocking the corridor, her usually pleasant face set in uncharacteristic determination. "Mother Catherine has forbidden entrance to this area, Monsignor. We have sisters in spiritual retreat." "Sister Elizabeth," Monsignor Kelly said gently but firmly, "I speak with the authority of Archbishop Hughes. Open the door, or I shall be forced to consider you in violation of your vow of obedience." Sister Elizabeth's composure cracked slightly. "You don't understand what you're doing," she whispered, her voice suddenly desperate. "He will be most displeased." "He?" Father Ryan questioned. "Do you mean Bishop Henny?" Sister Elizabeth merely shook her head, eyes darting nervously toward the windows as if expecting someone to appear. After a moment's hesitation, she stepped aside. The locked door, when finally opened under threat of ecclesiastical censure, revealed a shocking scene. 5 nuns, including the missing Sister Rebecca, were confined in what had once been a storage room. The space, perhaps 15 feet square, contained only a chamber pot in the corner and thin pallets on the floor. The single high window had been boarded over, leaving the room in near darkness, save for the light now streaming through the open door. The women were pale, malnourished, and showed signs of physical abuse. Their habits were torn and soiled, their faces gaunt with hunger and fear. One, later identified as Sister Josephine Brady, was heavily pregnant, her swollen belly incongruous against her thin limbs. The stench of unwashed bodies and human waste was overwhelming. Father Ryan turned aside momentarily, fighting nausea, while Monsignor Kelly crossed himself in horror. "In the name of all that's holy," the Monsignor whispered, "what has happened here?" Sister Rebecca, once robust and quick to smile, now a skeletal figure with hollow eyes, struggled to her feet. "Father Ryan," she managed, her voice cracked from disuse or screaming, "you came back." "They're preparing us," she whispered as Father Ryan helped her to a chair hastily brought from the corridor. "For the doctor. For the house in Chicago." "What doctor?" Monsignor Kelly asked gently, kneeling beside her despite his age and dignity. "What house in Chicago?" "Dr. Matthews," Sister Rebecca replied, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He comes to examine us, to see which ones are suitable." She closed her eyes, trembling. "The men pay more for nuns, for brides of Christ. That's what Mother Catherine tells them." While Father Ryan and Monsignor Kelly attended to the imprisoned nuns, ensuring they received water, food, and medical attention, the other priests made equally disturbing discoveries elsewhere in the convent. In Sister Margaret's private quarters, accessible only through a hidden door in the infirmary, they found shelves lined with suspicious medicines, laudanum, chloroform, and other substances typically used for rendering patients unconscious. A leather-bound journal detailed treatments administered to various nuns with clinical notes about their responses and suitability for transportation. Simultaneously, the priests examining the financial records discovered alarming discrepancies. While the convent reported minimal income from donations and manual work, its accounts showed regular, substantial deposits, far more money than a frontier convent could legitimately earn. Most disturbing were coded entries referring to packages delivered and special commissions completed, each corresponding to the disappearance of a nun. Transferred Sister Agnes O'Connor, 4 May 1855, commission $400, read one entry. Package delivered to Chicago establishment, condition excellent. Another more disturbing, Sister Teresa Donovan, unsuitable for transfer due to resistance, terminated November 1856, no commission. As the investigation deepened, a pattern of horrific abuse and exploitation emerged. Through patient questioning of the traumatized nuns, Monsignor Kelly pieced together the truth. Mother Catherine, Sister Elizabeth, and Sister Margaret were not legitimate religious leaders at all, but impostors who had infiltrated the Catholic system years earlier. Sister Claire O'Donnell, one of the rescued nuns, provided crucial testimony once she felt safe enough to speak. "I overheard them one night," she whispered, clutching a blanket around her shoulders despite the room's warmth. Mother Catherine was arguing with Sister Margaret about their past. She called her Catherine, said they'd come too far to risk exposure now, that they'd changed identities before and could do it again if necessary. The real Mother Catherine Murphy had died shortly after arriving in Wisconsin, poisoned, according to testimony from Sister Margaret's former assistant in the infirmary. She added something to Mother Catherine's evening tea, the young nun testified. The original Mother Catherine began vomiting blood that very night. Sister Margaret diagnosed it as consumption and isolated her. None of us were permitted to attend her in her final days. The 3 senior nuns had then systematically taken control of the convent, establishing connections with a network of so-called houses of charity across the Midwest that were, in reality, brothels catering to wealthy clients with specific preferences. Young nuns who caught their attention, particularly those noted for their beauty, innocence, or gentle nature, were prepared for a terrible fate. First came isolation through increasingly severe penances for fabricated infractions. Then drugging, often with laudanum from Sister Margaret's medical supplies. The selected nuns would be violated within the convent itself by paying benefactors, wealthy men from Chicago, Milwaukee, and as far away as St. Louis, who paid premium prices for the opportunity to defile brides of Christ. They would come after Compline, when the convent was supposed to be silent, Sister Rebecca explained, her voice emotionless, as if detachment was the only way she could relate such horrors. Men in fine clothes, smelling of cologne and whiskey, Mother Catherine, would lead them to the north wing where we were kept. They paid extra to have us wear our habits during the violation. Those who became pregnant, like Sister Josephine, were kept isolated until delivery, after which they would be transported to brothels in Chicago or St. Louis, where they would be forced into prostitution. Their religious background and forced pregnancy were marketed as special attractions for depraved clients. Many died within years from disease or abuse. Sister Margaret examined us regularly, Sister Rebecca continued. She kept records of our monthly cycles. If we missed our bleeding, she would laugh and tell Mother Catherine we'd be especially valuable now. The men paid more for those carrying children. The orphanage served as both cover and additional source of victims. Older girls approaching puberty would suddenly be adopted by generous benefactors, in reality sold to the same network of brothels. Boys were indeed placed with families, but as unpaid farm laborers, with Mother Catherine collecting substantial placement fees. Most horrifying were the fates of those who resisted too strongly or threatened to expose the operation. Sister Teresa Donovan, who had questioned the disappearances, had not been sent to Montreal as claimed. According to testimony from Sister Rebecca, Teresa had been held in the locked room for weeks, repeatedly assaulted, and when her spirit remained unbroken, strangled by the man called Callahan. Her body, along with those of at least 3 other nuns who had similarly resisted, lay buried in unmarked graves in the convent's vegetable garden. "Mother Catherine made us watch," Sister Claire said, tears streaming down her face. She said, "It was a lesson in obedience." Sister Teresa fought until the end. She was praying the rosary even as Callahan tightened the rope around her neck. As evening fell on that fateful April day, Monsignor Kelly ordered the immediate closure of St. Mary's Convent. The surviving nuns were removed to safety, local authorities were notified, and guards were posted to prevent anyone from fleeing or removing evidence. Mother Catherine, Sister Elizabeth, and Sister Margaret were placed under ecclesiastical arrest, confined to their cells under watch until civil authorities could take custody. "I was following orders," Sister Elizabeth whimpered as she was led to her cell. "Mother Catherine said it was God's will, that the money was needed for the church's greater glory." Mother Catherine maintained a stone-faced silence, her pale eyes revealing nothing of her thoughts as the door closed on her temporary prison. Only Sister Margaret showed emotion, a strange half-smile playing at her thin lips as she was led away. "You understand nothing of what you've discovered," she told Monsignor Kelly. "We serve a higher purpose than you can imagine." But the church's attempt to handle the matter discreetly soon unraveled. Mr. Callahan, the burly enforcer who had been absent during the inspection, returned after nightfall. Finding the convent under guard, he fled to Chicago, where he apparently warned his associates. By the time local sheriffs arrived the following morning with arrest warrants, Mother Catherine and Sister Margaret had somehow escaped their confined quarters. Only Sister Elizabeth remained, found kneeling in the chapel in a state of catatonic shock. "The window was still locked from the inside," reported the priest who had been guarding Mother Catherine's room. "The door showed no signs of forced exit. It's as if she vanished into thin air." More likely, the convent's long history had provided secret passages unknown even to the church authorities. Escape routes perhaps dating back to the building's origins as a lumber baron's mansion, where illicit meetings and emergency departures might have been anticipated in the rough frontier days. The subsequent civil investigation uncovered the full extent of the operation. Financial records seized from Mother Catherine's hidden safe revealed transactions totaling over $100,000, equivalent to roughly $3 million today, over 8 years. Coded ledgers identified 23 nuns and 17 orphaned girls who had been trafficked to brothels across the Midwest. Correspondence with business partners in Chicago, St. Louis, and even New Orleans detailed the specialized services offered and the premium prices commanded. "A genuine sister of charity, untouched before our establishment, minimum $300, read one letter to a Chicago brothel owner. Special requests, habit, religious implements, additional $50 per session. Pregnant sisters command $500 for exclusive patrons." Most damning was a small leather notebook found sewn into Sister Elizabeth's mattress. The notebook contained dates, names, and horrific details of the fates of each disappeared nun. Some entries were clinically detached. Sister Agnes, delivered to Chicago Operation September 1855, valued at $400. Others revealed the writer's disturbing personal pleasure in the suffering inflicted. Sister Teresa fought magnificently. Callahan enjoyed subduing her. Buried east corner of Beanfield, November 1856. The notebook also contained references to the doctor, evidently Dr. William Matthews, a once-respected physician from Chicago whose career had ended in scandal after allegations of inappropriate conduct with female patients. According to the notebook, Dr. Matthews provided medical examinations of the nuns, certifying their health and, most disturbingly, their virginity, a feature that significantly increased their value in the brothels. Dr. M confirms, Sister Rebecca suitable for premium placement, one entry noted. Recommends maximum usage before transfer to ensure appropriate behavior in Chicago establishment. The investigation extended to the convent grounds, where, guided by the notebook's cryptic references, authorities excavated several areas of the vegetable garden. There they found the remains of 4 nuns, buried in shallow graves among the bean plants and herbs. Forensic examination, primitive by modern standards but thorough for the time, confirmed Sister Rebecca's account. These women had died by strangulation, their bodies disposed of without ceremony or marker. One victim, identified as Sister Mary Collins by a small medallion of St. Bridget found with the remains, appeared to have been buried more recently than the others. The soil over her grave was barely settled, suggesting she had been killed just before or during Father Ryan's fateful visit, perhaps after delivering the note that ultimately led to the convent's exposure. Sister Elizabeth Foster, born Margaret Wilson, according to subsequent investigation, was the only one of the 3 leaders to face justice. Found mentally unfit to stand trial, she was committed to the Wisconsin State Asylum, where she died in 1863, having never spoken another word. Her medical records, preserved in state archives, describe her as catatonic except during night hours, when she screams about the master coming to punish her betrayal. Mother Catherine Murphy, real name unknown, and Sister Margaret Clark, identified later as Catherine Donovan, no relation to the murdered Sister Teresa, disappeared completely. Unconfirmed reports placed them in New Orleans, then Havana, operating similar schemes with young women immigrants, but they were never apprehended. A nationwide alert distributed their descriptions to law enforcement agencies across the country. Mother Catherine was described as approximately 45 years of age, 5 feet 8 inches tall, blue eyes, graying brown hair, speaks with slight Boston accent, carries herself with unusual authority. Sister Margaret was approximately 40 years of age, 5 feet 10 inches tall, very thin build, dark eyes, black hair with premature gray streaks, speaks precisely, knowledge of medical terminology. Despite these detailed descriptions and a substantial reward offered by both civil authorities and the church, the women seemed to vanish into America's vast frontier. Occasional reports would surface, 2 women matching their descriptions, seen boarding a steamboat in New Orleans or establishing a ladies' finishing school in Havana. But by the time authorities investigated, the women would be gone. Mr. Callahan, identified as James Callahan of Chicago, was captured 6 months later in a brothel raid and hung for the murder of a police officer during his arrest. Before his execution, he confirmed many details of the St. Mary's operation, but claimed ignorance of the leaders' whereabouts. They planned for this, he told the prison chaplain the night before his execution. Mother Catherine always said they had escape routes prepared, new identities waiting. They'd done it before, she said, changed their skins like snakes when necessary. When pressed about the references to the master found in Sister Elizabeth's writings, Callahan became agitated. Don't ask about him, he warned. He's not someone you want to know, not someone you want knowing you. Whether this master was a religious delusion, a code name for a high-ranking accomplice, or something else entirely, remains one of the unsolved mysteries of the St. Mary's case. No further documentation ever established his identity or confirmed his existence beyond these cryptic references. The church moved quickly to contain the scandal. Bishop Henney was quietly removed to a monastery in Europe, where he spent his remaining years in what church documents described as prayerful reflection on his administrative failings. His personal correspondence, however, suggests a man haunted by more than mere negligence. The blood of those poor women cries out to heaven, He wrote to a fellow bishop in 1860, "I cannot sleep for hearing their voices. Mother Catherine assured me the funds were for missionary work. I never questioned. God forgive me, I never questioned." The convent buildings were demolished, the land sold, and the proceeds used to establish a legitimate orphanage in Milwaukee. No mention was made in official church communications of the bodies discovered on the grounds or the crimes committed within those walls. The site was deconsecrated in a private ceremony attended only by Monsignor Kelly and Archbishop Hughes, with no public announcement. The surviving nuns were dispersed to convents across the country, each required to sign confidentiality agreements that would excommunicate them if they ever spoke of what had occurred at St. Mary's. Most lived out their lives in silent obedience, their trauma unaddressed, their suffering unacknowledged. Sister Josephine Brady gave birth to a daughter 2 months after her rescue. Despite her pleas to keep the child, church authorities placed the infant with a Catholic family in Pennsylvania, with strict instructions that the circumstances of her birth remain secret. This separation compounded Sister Josephine's trauma, and historical records indicate she died by suicide in 1861, leaving behind a letter that read simply, "I cannot forget. I cannot forgive. Not them, not the church, not myself. May God have mercy on us all." Sister Rebecca Murphy became an unlikely voice for reform within the church. Rejecting the imposed silence, she left religious life and, using the name Rachel Martin to avoid church censure, published an anonymous account titled The Dark Convent in 1865. Though the book was denounced by Catholic authorities as Protestant propaganda and quickly suppressed, surviving copies reveal a detailed account that aligns precisely with the official investigation records. In the book's conclusion, she wrote, "What happened at St. Mary's was not merely the work of 3 evil women who infiltrated holy orders. It was enabled by a system that values silence over truth, institution over individual, reputation over justice. Until the church confronts this fundamental flaw, there will be other St. Mary's, other victims, other crimes hidden behind sacred walls." The suppression of the Dark Convent was swift and nearly complete. Church authorities purchased and destroyed every copy they could locate. Catholic newspapers denounced it as anti-Catholic fiction and scurrilous propaganda. Protestant publishers, while initially eager to promote a work that confirmed their suspicions about Catholic institutions, became wary of legal action and ceased printing the book after its first run. Rachel Martin herself disappeared from public record after 1866. Some evidence suggests she relocated to California, where she established a home for women in difficult circumstances, an early form of shelter for abuse victims. If so, she carried the lessons of St. Mary's into a life dedicated to preventing similar suffering, though history has largely forgotten both her work and her witness. Father Thomas Ryan, whose persistence had uncovered the horror, was initially praised for his actions. However, as the church hierarchy began to worry about the scandal's potential damage, he found himself reassigned to a remote parish in northern Minnesota. His personal journal, discovered after his death in 1886, reveals his ongoing struggle with what he had witnessed. "I cannot forget the faces of those poor women, betrayed by those who claimed to represent Christ's church. I hear their cries in my dreams. I see Sister Rebecca's hollow eyes. I wonder about those we could not save, whose suffering continues in those houses of sin. Has God forgiven us for failing them? Has He forgiven the church for silencing the truth?" The final entry in his journal, dated January 1886, just days before his death, reads, 28 years since St. Mary's, and still the church keeps silent. The letters I send to Rome go unanswered. The new bishops act as if it never happened, but it did happen. They were real women with real souls, and they suffered real horrors. If the church will not speak for them, then I pray that someday someone will find this account and remember them. Remember Sister Agnes, Sister Bernadette, Sister Teresa, and all the others whose names deserve to be spoken, whose suffering deserves acknowledgement, whose lives mattered. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in St. Mary's intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next, as we uncover the final disturbing chapter of this American tragedy. The aftermath of the St. Mary's tragedy extended far beyond Wisconsin. The operation's exposure led to increased scrutiny of Catholic institutions throughout the Midwest, with diocesan inspectors conducting surprise visits to convents, orphanages, and schools. Several smaller operations were uncovered, none as extensive or horrific as St. Mary's, but enough to suggest that Catherine Murphy and her associates had created a template that others had followed. In Chicago, police raids on 3 houses of charity in late 1858 freed 9 former nuns and 13 young women who had been living as prostitutes under various forms of coercion. The rescued women's testimonies described a system virtually identical to what had been uncovered at St. Mary's. Religious authorities used as cover for sexual exploitation, with wealthy clients paying premium prices for the opportunity to violate women perceived as pure or sacred. One survivor, identified in police records only as ML, provided testimony that directly linked her captivity to St. Mary's. I was transferred from Wisconsin in 1856. Mother Catherine herself delivered me to Madame Rousseau's establishment in Chicago, telling me that if I ever attempted to escape, both the church and the law would punish me as a fallen woman. For nearly 2 years, I believed her. The brothel owners arrested in these raids implicated several prominent Chicago businessmen and politicians as both clients and investors in the operation. Ledgers seized during the raids contained the names of judges, bank presidents, and even 2 state legislators who had paid for sessions with former nuns. However, the cases mysteriously collapsed before reaching trial, with witnesses recanting or disappearing, evidence being lost, and judges issuing unusual procedural rulings that effectively ended the prosecutions. The Chicago Tribune of November 1858 noted this suspicious pattern. It appears that justice in our fair city extends only to those without powerful friends. The men whose names appeared in the brothel ledgers walk free, while the women they victimized remain scandalized and without recourse. In St. Louis, investigations into similar operations were even more aggressively suppressed. Monsignor Kelly, who had led the original inspection of St. Mary's, traveled there in 1859 to follow leads suggesting that as many as 7 of the missing St. Mary's nuns had been transported to brothels in that city. Within days of his arrival, he was severely beaten by unknown assailants and warned to return to New York. Though he survived the attack, Archbishop Hughes recalled him immediately, ending that line of investigation. Monsignor Kelly's private correspondence with Archbishop Hughes, unsealed in the New York Diocesan Archives in 1950, reveals his frustration. I believe we have uncovered merely the visible portion of a much larger evil. The tentacles of this operation extend into the highest levels of society, and perhaps even the church itself. I fear that powerful forces have determined that this matter shall proceed no further. The most profound consequences fell upon the survivors. The 12 nuns rescued from St. Mary's faced challenges that the church was ill-equipped to address. Those who had not been physically abused still bore psychological scars from years of living in fear, witnessing the disappearance of their sisters, and in some cases being forced to participate in the abuse of others under threat of punishment. Sister Claire O'Donnell, who had been forced to help restrain Sister Teresa during her murder, developed what modern psychiatry would recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Transferred to a convent in Philadelphia, she was repeatedly disciplined for screaming during the night and speaking inappropriately about her experiences at St. Mary's. Church records indicate she eventually abandoned religious life and was briefly institutionalized before disappearing from historical record entirely. The 5 women rescued from the locked room, Sisters Rebecca Murphy, Josephine Brady, Claire O'Donnell, Maria Fitzpatrick, and Anne Sullivan, had experienced the worst of the abuse. Their subsequent fates reflect the inadequate response to trauma in the 19th century, particularly within religious institutions that prioritize silence and forgiveness over healing and justice. Sister Josephine's tragic end has already been noted, her suicide following the forced separation from her child. Sister Maria Fitzpatrick remained within the church, but was described by her superiors as unstable and prone to hysterical episodes. She spent her remaining years in a contemplative order that required minimal interaction with others, dying in 1870 of what was recorded as nervous exhaustion. Sister Anne Sullivan, however, channeled her trauma into advocacy. Working within the constraints of her vows and the Church's desire for silence, she quietly established informal support networks for nuns who had suffered abuse. Her correspondence, discovered in the archives of her Boston convent after her death in 1899, reveals a woman determined to prevent future St. Mary's while maintaining her faith in the Church's ultimate goodness, despite its human failings. We must distinguish between the divine institution and its flawed human stewards, she wrote to a fellow survivor in 1875. What happened to us was not God's will, but human evil cloaking itself in sacred garments. Our task now is to ensure that the garments cannot so easily be stolen again. The most haunting questions surrounding the St. Mary's case involve the total number of victims. The official church investigation acknowledged 23 nuns and 17 orphaned girls who were confirmed as trafficked or murdered. However, Sister Elizabeth's notebook contained references to rural acquisitions. Young women who were apparently abducted from isolated farms and settlements, never reported missing due to the frontier's transient nature, and fed into the same trafficking network. Local newspaper archives from the period contain scattered reports of young women vanishing from communities within a 50-mile radius of St. Mary's. Domestic servants who supposedly returned east, farm daughters who allegedly married and moved west, young widows who were said to have sought new opportunities in the cities. How many of these disappearances were connected to the St. Mary's operation remains unknown. An entry in Sister Elizabeth's notebook, dated October 1857, suggests the scope. Rural acquisitions this year, 14. Superior quality, primarily Scandinavian. Special commission from New Orleans fulfilled. Equally disturbing is the fate of the disappeared nuns who were never accounted for. Of the 23 who vanished from St. Mary's between 1854 and 1858, only 9 were definitively located. 4 confirmed murdered and buried on the grounds, 5 rescued from brothels in subsequent raids. What became of the other 14 women? Records suggest they were sold to more distant operations in New Orleans, San Francisco, and possibly even overseas. Despite periodic efforts by individual church investigators, their ultimate fates remain unknown. A partial answer came in 1872, when a Catholic missionary in San Francisco reported encountering a woman in a waterfront brothel who claimed to have once been Sister Catherine Walsh of St. Mary's Convent in Wisconsin. By the time church authorities followed up on this report, the woman had died of typhoid fever, her body buried in an unmarked pauper's grave. Whether she was indeed one of the missing nuns cannot be confirmed, but the missionary's detailed description of her account aligns precisely with the known facts of the St. Mary's case. The most enduring mystery surrounds Mother Catherine Murphy and Sister Margaret Clark, the architects of the entire operation. How had they originally infiltrated legitimate religious orders? Historical research suggests that Catherine Donovan, the real identity of Sister Margaret, had briefly entered a convent in Ireland before being expelled for unspecified moral failings. She apparently traveled to America in the 1840s, where she likely met her future accomplice. Together, they developed a scheme to use the rapid expansion of Catholic institutions in frontier America as cover for their criminal enterprise. Their disappearance after the exposure of St. Mary's led to one of the most extensive manhunts of the pre-Civil War era, though conducted with remarkable discretion due to the Church's desire to minimize publicity. Reported sightings placed them in New Orleans, Havana, and later Mexico City, always associated with religious or charitable institutions that catered to wealthy patrons. The last credible report, from a former Chicago police detective hired by the New York Diocese to track them, placed both women in Veracruz, Mexico in 1863, operating a finishing school for young ladies that the detective described as bearing all the hallmarks of their previous enterprise. The detective's report, preserved in the New York Diocesan Archives, concludes ominously, "I believe the women known as Murphy and Clark have established a new operation with the protection of wealthy Mexican patrons. However, I was warned in most violent terms to abandon my investigation. 2 local officials who had agreed to assist me were found dead the morning of our planned inspection of the school. I can only conclude that these women enjoy protection at the highest levels of society." The legacy of St. Mary's extends beyond the immediate tragedy. The case contributed to a deepening of anti-Catholic sentiment in America during the 1850s and 1860s, with Protestant publications citing it, often in sensationalized form, as evidence of Catholic moral corruption. This in turn led to Catholic communities becoming more insular and defensive, reinforcing the very culture of secrecy that had enabled the abuse. More significantly, the St. Mary's case established a pattern of institutional response to abuse that would be repeated for generations. Initial investigation, limited accountability focused primarily on direct perpetrators, protection of higher authorities who enabled through negligence or complicity, relocation of survivors to ensure their silence, and ultimately, a return to institutional normalcy with minimal structural reform. Archbishop Hughes, in private correspondence with Vatican officials that remained sealed until 1975, acknowledged this systemic failure while defending the Church's handling of the case. "We have removed the immediate cause of scandal and provided for the care of the victims. However, I must express my concern that our system of oversight contains fundamental flaws that permitted such horror to continue unchecked for years. I recommend a complete review of how we select and monitor those in positions of authority within our institutions." His recommendations, however prescient, appear to have been quietly filed away rather than implemented. The Church's preference for handling such matters internally and discreetly would persist well into the modern era. The physical traces of St. Mary's Convent have been systematically erased. The demolished buildings left no visible foundation. The land, sold and resold over generations, now hosts a suburban development whose residents have no knowledge of what occurred there. Church archives relating to the case were heavily redacted during the early 20th century, with the most damning documents sealed or destroyed. Even the graves of the murdered nuns were left unmarked, their remains eventually built over without consecration or acknowledgement. Yet the story persists through scattered documents, personal journals, newspaper archives, and oral histories, passed down through generations of Wisconsin Catholic families. These fragments, when assembled, reveal not just the horror of what occurred at St. Mary's, but the larger systemic failures that made it possible, the dangers of unquestioned authority, the vulnerability of isolated communities, and the human capacity for both extraordinary evil and extraordinary courage in confronting it. Father Thomas Ryan, whose determination brought the horrors to light, wrote in his final journal entry a plea that resonates across the centuries. Remember them. Remember that they lived, that they suffered, and that their suffering mattered. In uncovering their story, however incompletely, we honor that request and perhaps learn something essential about institutional power, human vulnerability, and the constant vigilance required to protect the innocent from those who would exploit sacred trust for profane purposes. The Wisconsin Historical Society maintains a small collection of materials related to St. Mary's Convent, accessible only to credentialed researchers. Among these materials is a water-damaged letter, apparently written by Sister Anne Sullivan in 1880, addressed to the adult daughter of Sister Josephine Brady, the child conceived in captivity and adopted away at birth. The letter was never sent, as Sister Anne could not locate the young woman, but its closing lines serve as a fitting epitaph for this dark chapter in American religious history. Should you ever learn of your origins, know this: your mother was not shamed, but brave. The evil done at St. Mary's was not of God or genuine faith, but of human cruelty, wearing sacred garments. The true convent was not the limestone building that housed such horrors, but the community of women who sustained each other through them, who whispered prayers and held hands in darkness, who remembered each other's names when all else was taken, who believed in salvation even when God seemed absent. That is the legacy I wish to leave you, not the story of our suffering but of our endurance. This mystery shows us that the darkest evils often hide behind the most sacred facades, and that institutional silence can perpetuate suffering long after the initial crimes. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there still secrets buried in Wisconsin soil? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video. The case of St. Mary's Convent ultimately became a watershed moment in American religious history, though one deliberately obscured from public memory. The systematic investigation following the initial exposure revealed networks of corruption extending far beyond Wisconsin's borders, implicating church officials, businessmen, and politicians across the Midwest. Though the church attempted to characterize the horror as the isolated actions of 3 impostors who had infiltrated their ranks, internal documents later leaked by conscience-stricken diocesan officials told a different story. Bishop Henney had received at least 7 letters between 1855 and 1858 expressing concerns about disappearances and financial irregularities at St. Mary's. Each complaint was followed by a substantial special donation from Mother Catherine to the bishop's cathedral building fund, after which the complaints were filed away without action. The leaked correspondence included a particularly damning exchange from 1856, in which a junior priest reported to Bishop Henney that a local farmer had found a blood-stained nun's habit in the woods near St. Mary's. The bishop's response directed the priest to return the garment to Mother Catherine with our compliments, and assure the farmer that theatrical performances at the convent sometimes employ red paint for dramatic effect. A donation of $500 to the cathedral fund followed 3 days later. Local historian Margaret Holloway, whose grandmother had been a domestic servant at a neighboring estate, recorded an oral history in 1932 that adds another disturbing layer to the story. Grandmother said people knew something was wrong at St. Mary's. On still nights, screams could be heard coming from the north wing. When neighbors inquired, they were told it was spiritual exercises or penitential prayers. No one questioned further because in those days, Catholic practices seemed foreign and mysterious to Protestant sensibilities. But grandmother said the local children would run past the convent grounds, afraid of the sad ladies in black who watched from the windows with empty eyes. In 1890, nearly 3 decades after the events, an elderly woman arrived at the Chicago office of the Pinkerton Detective Agency. She identified herself as Mary Callahan, sister of the executed James Callahan. She carried a leather portfolio containing documents she claimed her brother had hidden before his capture. correspondence between Mother Catherine and clients across the country, detailed financial records, and most disturbingly, a list of clerical and political figures who had either patronized or protected the operation. My brother was no innocent, Mary Callahan reportedly told the Pinkerton agent, her face lined with years of carrying the terrible knowledge. He did terrible things at that place, things he confessed to me before they hanged him. But he was a mere servant in this devil's work. Before he died, he told me where to find these papers. He said to keep them safe until the principal architects of this evil had gone to their judgment. Now that they're dead, the truth can be told without fear. The Pinkerton agent, a devout Catholic himself, was so disturbed by the documents that he delivered them not to his superiors, but directly to Cardinal James Gibbons in Baltimore. The cardinal acknowledged receipt of the portfolio in a brief letter to Mary Callahan, assuring her that appropriate actions would be taken. No public investigation followed, and the documents disappeared into church archives. "I have examined the materials you provided," Cardinal Gibbons wrote in his personal response to Mary Callahan, preserved in her family records. "While I share your horror at what they reveal, I must consider the damage that public exposure would cause to the faith of countless innocent Catholics. The primary malefactors have faced divine judgment. The victims have been called home to God's mercy. Perhaps the greatest service to both is to let this darkness remain buried, while ensuring such evil cannot take root again." Mary Callahan's subsequent attempts to bring the documents to public attention were consistently thwarted. Newspaper editors declined to publish her story, citing lack of evidence. When she attempted to publish a pamphlet herself, the printer mysteriously backed out after receiving a visit from men in clerical attire. Her home was broken into twice, though nothing of apparent value was taken. Finally, in 1892, she entrusted copies of the most significant documents to her nephew, with instructions to preserve them for future generations. In 1908, a fire in the Baltimore Archdiocesan Records Room destroyed numerous historical documents, including, reportedly, the entire Callahan portfolio. Church officials described the fire as an unfortunate accident, though former employees later claimed it had been suspiciously contained to specific document sections. Only the St. Mary's records and similar sensitive materials were destroyed, alleged Thomas Moran, a former diocesan archivist, in a deathbed statement recorded by his son in 1947. "I was instructed to ensure those specific documents were stored together against all proper archival practice. When the fire occurred, it consumed exactly those shelves and no others. Draw your own conclusions." The final confirmed chapter in the St. Mary's saga came in 1912, when workers renovating an abandoned mansion in Veracruz, Mexico, discovered a hidden room containing the mummified remains of two elderly women. Among their possessions were Catholic, religious items, forged identification documents in multiple names, and a substantial quantity of American and Mexican currency. Most telling was a small golden locket containing a miniature painted image of St. Mary's Convent as it had appeared. In the 1850s, the bodies were seated in chairs facing each other, reported La Verdad de Veracruz on March 12, 1912. They appeared to have died simultaneously, perhaps while taking their evening tea, which was found set out before them. The cups contained traces of a substance local physicians identified as a powerful poison derived from local flora. Whether this represented suicide or murder remains unknown. Mexican authorities, uncertain of the significance of their discovery, eventually released information to American newspapers. Several survivors of St. Mary's, by then elderly women themselves, identified personal items found with the bodies as belonging to Mother Catherine Murphy and Sister Margaret Clark. The women had apparently died sometime around 1880, living out their final years in wealthy seclusion, but never escaping the physical confines of their secrets. Most disturbing was a leather-bound journal found with the bodies. containing entries that suggested the women had continued their operations in Mexico for nearly 2 decades before their deaths. References to acquisitions, placements, and special clients mirrored the coded language used in the St. Mary's records. The journal's final entry, dated the apparent day of their deaths, contained a cryptic message. "He comes tonight. We have failed him for the last time." The identity of this him, whether a human accomplice or something more metaphysical, remains one of the enduring mysteries of the case. Some researchers have suggested connections to esoteric religious practices that emerged in certain wealthy circles during the late 19th century, while others propose more mundane explanations involving high-ranking patrons of their human trafficking operation. Investigations into the Veracruz mansion revealed further horrors. Beneath the garden, authorities discovered the remains of at least 12 young women buried over the course of 2 decades. Records in the mansion suggested these women had been lured from poor families with promises of domestic employment or religious training, only to meet fates similar to the nuns of St. Mary's. "The evil that began in Wisconsin did not end there," wrote the New York Times in a rare piece acknowledging the St. Mary's case. "It merely migrated south, like a cancer seeking new tissue to corrupt." One wonders how many other such operations may exist, undetected behind respectable facades. The American Catholic Church's response to the Veracruz discoveries was muted. A brief statement acknowledged that individuals formerly associated with a disbanded Wisconsin religious community had been identified among the deceased, but emphasized that these persons had been excommunicated and were operating without church sanction. No mention was made of the trafficking operation or its victims. Today, a small memorial garden stands in Milwaukee, established in 2010 by an anonymous donor, dedicated to the forgotten women of St. Mary's. No official church recognition accompanies the memorial, and no plaques list the names of the victims. Yet each spring, flowers appear mysteriously at the site, left, some say, by descendants of Sister Mary Collins, whose courage in slipping a note to a farm boy ultimately brought the darkness into light. Amateur historians researching the case have faced unusual obstacles. Records disappear from archives just before scheduled research visits. Permission to access church documents is revoked without explanation. Several independent scholars report experiencing strange occurrences while pursuing the story, threatening phone calls, break-ins where only research materials were disturbed, even physical intimidation by unidentified men. "Someone still doesn't want this story told in full," concluded historian Rebecca Lawson in her 2003 article, Buried Secrets: The Unfinished Investigation of St. Mary's Convent. Whether to protect the reputations of prominent families whose ancestors were implicated or to prevent damage to institutional credibility, powerful interests continue to obscure this dark chapter of American religious history. The Wisconsin countryside has long since reclaimed the land where St. Mary's once stood. New communities, new churches, new generations have risen, unaware of the horrors that once occurred beneath their soil. But on certain autumn nights when fog rolls in from Lake Michigan and the wind whispers through the trees, local residents sometimes report hearing faint sounds, what some describe as women's voices chanting evening prayers, others as muffled cries for help. Whether these are mere tricks of the wind or something more is a question each listener must answer for themselves. In 2018, during construction of a new housing development near the former convent grounds, workers uncovered a small metal box while excavating for a foundation. Inside was a rosary, a folded habit veil, and a handwritten list of names, 23 in total, with the simple inscription, "Remember us." County officials turned the items over to the diocesan archives, where they reportedly remain today, uncatalogued and inaccessible to researchers. The family of Jimmy Fletcher, the farm boy who delivered Sister Mary's desperate note to Father Ryan, preserved their own memorial to the St. Mary's victims. For 5 generations, they have maintained a small shelf in their farmhouse kitchen containing a silver cross, believed to be the very one Sister Mary gave Jimmy as payment for his courage. Beside it stands a handwritten list of the nuns' names, carefully copied from newspaper accounts and updated whenever new information came to light. Great-great-grandpa Jimmy said we should never forget those ladies. Current family patriarch Robert Fletcher told a local newspaper in 2020. He said sometimes the truth gets buried, but that doesn't make it any less true. Those women lived, they suffered, they mattered. What remains undeniable is that between 1854 and 1862, in the supposedly sacred confines of a Wisconsin convent, human evil reached extraordinary depths. That such evil was possible, and that the systems meant to prevent it instead enabled. It stands as a sobering reminder of our capacity for both depravity and denial. Perhaps the true horror of St. Mary's lies not in what happened within those limestone walls, but in how easily it was erased from history once those walls came down. Remember Sister Agnes, Sister Bernadette, Sister Teresa, and all the others. Remember that they lived, that they suffered, and that their suffering mattered.